Montana Territory, 1875. The wind howled mercilessly across the plains as the snow piled high against the weathered walls of Samuel Armstrong's lonely cabin. At 25, he had already lived enough hardship for several lifetimes. The lantern light cast long shadows across the rough-hewn table where he sat cleaning his Colt revolver, his only faithful companion in this unforgiving landscape. Samuel ran his hand through his dark brown hair, his clean-shaven face carrying the premature lines of a man who'd learned early that sentiment was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. His broad shoulders and lean, muscular frame spoke of endless days on horseback and nights under the stars, driving cattle across the territory for whoever paid fair wages. No sense in dreaming of more, he muttered to himself, a habit born from too many solitary nights. The frontier ain't for dreamers. It's for survivors. 3 years earlier, he'd watched helplessly as influenza claimed his parents and younger sister at their homestead in Kansas. After burying them, he'd ridden west with nothing but his horse, his gun, and a vow never to let himself care that deeply again. Caring made you vulnerable, and vulnerability got you killed out here where nature and man competed to determine which could be more ruthless. Samuel had built his small cabin near the growing settlement of Clearwater, taking occasional jobs with local ranchers, but mostly keeping to himself. The townspeople had long since labeled him a loner, a reputation he cultivated deliberately. Better to be seen as standoffish than to form attachments that would inevitably end in loss. As the blizzard intensified, Samuel added another log to the fire, watching the sparks rise up the chimney. Sometimes in these quiet moments, a treacherous longing would creep into his heart, a wish for someone to share these simple pleasures with, someone to break the silence. But he always pushed such thoughts away. In his experience, the frontier offered two choices, solitude or heartbreak. What Samuel truly needed, though he would never admit it, was someone to remind him that there was more to living than merely surviving. Someone to show him that even in this harsh land, the human heart could still find room to grow. The blizzard raged for 3 days, finally breaking on the morning of the 4th. Samuel emerged from his cabin to assess the damage, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The world had been transformed into a glittering white expanse that stretched toward the distant mountains. Beautiful, but deadly to anyone caught unprepared. He was checking his woodpile when the sound reached him, faint at first, then unmistakable. A cry for help, carried on the crisp winter air. Samuel hesitated. Getting involved in others' troubles was exactly what he'd sworn to avoid. But something, instinct, perhaps, or the last remnants of the man he used to be, propelled him toward his stable. Within minutes, he'd saddled his horse and was following the sounds across the snow-covered meadow that separated his property from the main road. He found the overturned wagon half a mile away, its canvas cover torn and one wheel shattered. A team of exhausted horses stood nearby, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. And there, struggling to free something from beneath the wagon, was a young woman. "Hold there," Samuel called, dismounting in a fluid motion. "You'll hurt yourself trying to lift that alone." The woman straightened, pushing back a strand of golden blonde hair that had escaped from beneath her bonnet. Her cheeks were flushed from exertion and cold, her blue eyes bright with determination rather than fear. "My supplies are trapped underneath," she explained, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "I need to retrieve them before nightfall." Samuel approached cautiously, taking in the situation. The woman wore a practical traveling dress of deep blue wool, now dusted with snow and mud. She couldn't have been more than 20, yet she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling difficulties alone. "I'm Samuel Armstrong," he offered, removing his gloves. "My cabin's not far. Let me help you with this, then we can figure out what to do next." "Tabitha Vaughn," she replied with a slight nod. "I'm grateful for the assistance, Mr. Armstrong." Together, they managed to prop up the wagon enough for Tabitha to pull out several crates and bundles. Samuel noticed her hands were red and raw from the cold, yet she worked methodically, prioritizing certain items. "Were you traveling alone?" he asked, scanning the area for other passengers. "Yes," Tabitha said, securing a wooden box that clinked with what sounded like glass bottles. "I'm the new schoolteacher for Clearwater. I was supposed to arrive last week, but the weather delayed my journey from Bozeman." Samuel's brow furrowed. The school board sent a woman alone through mountain passes in winter? The school board expected me in November, she corrected, a hint of amusement in her voice despite their predicament. I was delayed in Denver caring for my ailing aunt. The choice to travel now was mine alone. As they worked, Samuel learned that Tabitha was 22 and had come from St. Louis originally. She'd been teaching in Denver for 2 years before accepting the position in Clearwater, drawn by the promise of better pay and the challenge of establishing a proper school in a growing frontier town. This wagon won't move again without repairs, Samuel finally declared, examining the broken axle. And another storm's brewing. You can see it in those clouds. Tabitha followed his gaze to the western horizon, where dark clouds were indeed gathering. Her expression remained composed, but Samuel detected a momentary flicker of uncertainty. Is there an inn in Clearwater where I might stay until this can be repaired? She asked. Samuel shook his head. Clearwater's still 10 miles from here, and the road will be impassable soon. He hesitated, weighing his words carefully. I have a cabin nearby. It's modest, but you're welcome to shelter there until it's safe to continue your journey. The offer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Samuel hadn't invited anyone to his home since building it. The thought of sharing his private space with a stranger, especially a young, unmarried woman, went against every rule he'd set for himself. Yet leaving her to the mercy of another blizzard was unthinkable. Tabitha studied him for a long moment, clearly conducting her own assessment of the risks. Finally, she nodded. That would be most kind, Mr. Armstrong. I accept your hospitality, though I insist on compensating you for the inconvenience. No need, he said gruffly, already loading her most important possessions onto his horse. We'll come back for the rest when the weather permits. As they trudged through deepening snow toward his cabin, Samuel felt an unfamiliar disquiet. He'd convinced himself that isolation was preferable to vulnerability, that the frontier was no place for forming attachments. Yet here he was, leading a stranger, a beautiful, educated woman from civilization, into his sanctuary. He told himself it was simply human decency, nothing more. But a voice deep within whispered that fate had just dealt him a hand he hadn't expected, and the rules of his carefully constructed solitude were about to be challenged. The cabin seemed smaller with Tabitha inside it. Samuel busied himself stoking the fire and preparing a simple meal of beans and venison, acutely aware of her presence as she arranged her belongings in the corner he'd cleared for her. You have books, she remarked, noticing the small shelf beside his bed. Thoreau, Whitman, Shakespeare. Samuel nodded without elaboration. He didn't explain that reading was his one concession to the life he'd left behind, his only escape from the isolation he'd chosen. You surprise me, Mr. Armstrong, Tabitha continued, warming her hands by the fire. Most frontiersmen I've encountered prefer dime novels if they read at all. Most frontiersmen haven't buried their family and carried their library 2,000 miles to remember them by. He replied more sharply than intended. A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. When Samuel finally turned from the cookstove, he found Tabitha watching him with an expression that wasn't pity, as he'd feared, but something closer to recognition. My parents died in a steamboat explosion when I was 16, she said quietly. I understand what it means to carry ghosts. Samuel didn't know how to respond. For 3 years, he'd avoided conversations that ventured beyond the practical concerns of weather and work. He'd forgotten the disarming intimacy of shared grief. The stew's ready, he said instead, retreating to safer ground. They ate in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than Samuel was accustomed to. Less empty, somehow. When Tabitha insisted on washing the dishes afterward, he didn't argue, using the time to bring in more firewood and check on the horses. Outside, the snow had begun falling again, thick flakes swirling in the lantern light. Samuel stood watching it for longer than necessary, trying to understand the strange unease that had settled in his chest. It wasn't discomfort exactly, more like the feeling of muscles long and used suddenly being called into service. When he returned, Tabitha had arranged a makeshift bed for herself near the fire, using her own blankets atop a pallet of furs Samuel provided. I apologize for the lack of proper accommodations, he said, hanging his coat by the door. Mr. Armstrong, I've spent the past week sleeping in a wagon, she replied with a slight smile. This is luxury by comparison. Later, lying in his own bed with a curtain hastily strung between them for propriety's sake, Samuel found himself more awake than he'd been in years. The rhythm of another person's breathing in his space, soft, steady, alive, sparked memories of family, of connection, of all he'd determined to live without. "Mr. Armstrong?" Tabitha's voice came softly through the darkness. "May I ask you something?" "Samuel," he corrected, surprising himself. "If we're to be snowbound together, you might as well use my given name." A pause. "Samuel, then. Why did you help me today? You strike me as someone who prefers to avoid entanglements." The question hung in the air as Samuel searched for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much of himself. "Even a loner has certain obligations," he finally said. "No one survives the frontier by ignoring those in need." "Is that all it is? Obligation? What else would it be?" He kept his tone neutral. "Humanity," she suggested. "Connection. The recognition that we're not meant to face this world entirely alone." Samuel stared into the darkness, discomfited by how easily she'd identified the very belief he'd worked so hard to reject. "That's a dangerous philosophy out here," he said. "The frontier takes more than it gives. Those who forget that lesson rarely get a chance to learn it twice." "Perhaps," Tabitha conceded. "Or perhaps the frontier simply asks more of our hearts, not less." Samuel had no response to that. He listened as her breathing gradually slowed into the rhythm of sleep, while his own thoughts continued their restless circling well into the night. The storm lasted for 5 days, confining them to the small cabin. What began as awkward necessity gradually evolved into a comfortable routine. Samuel tended to the horses and kept the fire burning, while Tabitha proved unexpectedly resourceful in transforming his basic provisions into more palatable meals. In the evenings, she sometimes read aloud from his books, her voice bringing new life to familiar words. During those days of enforced proximity, Samuel found himself talking more than he had in years. Tabitha had a gift for asking questions that bypassed his defenses, about his childhood in Ohio, his family's ill-fated journey west, his work as a cowhand on various ranches throughout the territory. In turn, she shared stories of her own. Teaching in a Denver schoolhouse where half the children spoke no English, nursing her aunt through consumption, her determination to establish a proper education for the children of Clearwater. "Why here?" Samuel asked her on the 4th evening as they sat before the fire. "A woman with your education could find more comfortable positions back east." Tabitha considered the question, absently tucking a strand of golden hair behind her ear. At 22, she possessed a serene confidence that made her seem both younger and older at once. Innocent in her optimism, but wise in her understanding of hardship. "I believe education matters most where it's hardest to obtain," she finally said. "These children deserve the same opportunities as those in Boston or New York. More, perhaps, because their lives will demand more of them." "You might be disappointed," Samuel warned. "Frontier towns value practical skills over book learning. Many parents will keep their children home to work as soon as they're able." "Then I'll have to prove that education is practical," she countered with quiet determination. "That knowledge and beauty have a place even here, especially here." Samuel studied her face in the firelight, struck by the contrast between her delicate features and the steel in her convictions. "You truly believe that, don't you? That beauty can survive here?" "I know it can," she said, her gaze meeting his steadily. "I've seen it in the sunrise over the mountains, in the wildflowers that push through rocky soil, in the way communities come together after tragedy." She paused. "And in the kindness of strangers who risk their own comfort to help those in need." Samuel looked away first, uncomfortable with the implication. "The storm's weakening," he said, changing the subject. "If tomorrow's clear, we can retrieve the rest of your belongings and assess the wagon damage." Tabitha allowed the deflection, but Samuel felt her watching him with that same thoughtful expression she'd worn since their first meeting, as if she were reading a text written in a language she was only beginning to decipher. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They rode together to the wagon, where Samuel confirmed what he'd suspected: the axle was beyond repair. "The blacksmith in Clearwater could make you a new one," he explained. "But it'll take time, especially with the passes still dangerous for supply wagons." Tabitha nodded, examining the splintered wood. "Then it seems I must impose on your hospitality a while longer." unless there's another option I'm not seeing. Samuel hesitated. The rational course would be to take her to town immediately, where she could stay at the boarding house until permanent arrangements were made. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence brought an unexpected hollowness. There's no rush, he found himself saying. The school won't be ready until spring anyway, and two can live as easily as one until the roads improve. The surprise in Tabitha's eyes mirrored his own internal astonishment. Had he really just invited a virtual stranger to share his home indefinitely? It defied every rule he'd set for himself, every lesson the frontier had taught him about self-preservation. Are you certain? She asked carefully. I wouldn't want to disrupt your life. It's already disrupted, he replied with unexpected honesty. Might as well see it through. As January gave way to February, Samuel's small cabin became the staging ground for a quiet revolution. Tabitha transformed their coexistence with subtle but undeniable changes. Wildflowers preserved from autumn arranged in a tin cup on the table, the smell of fresh bread rising from the cook stove, the sound of humming as she worked. For his part, Samuel found himself making his own adjustments, rising earlier to ensure the cabin was warm before she woke, taking greater care with his appearance, even expanding the small stable to accommodate her horses alongside his own. They established boundaries that respected propriety while acknowledging their unusual circumstances. Samuel often rode out for days at a time, taking work with nearby ranches to earn extra money. These absences maintained his sense of independence while, paradoxically, giving him something he'd lacked before: the anticipation of return, of being welcomed. During one such absence in late February, a second blizzard struck with unexpected ferocity. Samuel was helping a neighboring rancher with a difficult calving when the storm hit, forcing him to remain there for 3 days. By the time he could safely ride home, his worry for Tabitha had grown into something approaching panic, an emotion so foreign that he barely recognized it in himself. He pushed his horse harder than wisdom dictated, arriving at the cabin as twilight deepened into night. The sight of smoke rising from the chimney released a tension he hadn't acknowledged carrying. When he threw open the door, the wave of relief at seeing Tabitha safe by the fire nearly buckled his knees. She looked up from the book in her lap, her face lighting with genuine pleasure. Samuel, thank heavens. I was beginning to worry. Likewise, he admitted, shrugging off his snow-crusted coat. The Palmer Creek crossing was nearly impassable. I wasn't certain I'd make it back tonight. Tabitha rose quickly, taking his coat and hanging it by the fire. You're half frozen. Sit down. I've kept stew warming for you. As she busied herself preparing a plate, Samuel became aware of subtle changes to the cabin. New curtains framed the single window, made from fabric he recognized from one of her dresses. A small collection of pine cones and interesting stones had appeared on the mantel. And in the corner, her area had expanded slightly, with books and papers neatly organized on a small table he didn't recognize. Did you build that? He asked, nodding toward the table. I did, she confirmed, bringing him a steaming bowl. I hope you don't mind. I found some lumber in the lean-to and thought I might create a workspace for planning lessons. Samuel should have been irritated by the presumption. Instead, he felt an unexpected admiration for her resourcefulness. It's good work, he said, examining the simple but sturdy construction. Where did you learn carpentry? My father was a furniture maker before he became a merchant, she explained, sitting across from him. He believed his daughter should know how to use tools as well as any son would. She hesitated. I was worried about you. The simple statement, delivered without dramatic emphasis, struck Samuel with surprising force. How long had it been since anyone had worried about his welfare? Since his presence or absence had mattered to another living soul. I'm sorry for causing you concern, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. I should have anticipated the storm better. You needn't apologize, Tabitha assured him. I merely wish to express that your safe return brings me joy. Samuel focused on his food, unsure how to respond to such straightforward sentiment. Yet as the evening progressed, he found himself recounting details of his journey that he would ordinarily have kept to himself. The difficult birth of twin calves, the rancher's gratitude, the challenging ride home through snowdrifts higher than his horse's chest. Tabitha listened attentively, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When Samuel described nearly losing his way in the whiteout conditions, Her hand moved instinctively toward his on the table before she caught herself and withdrew it. That night, lying in his bed with the curtain once again drawn between them, Samuel confronted an uncomfortable truth. The life he'd built for himself, the life he'd convinced himself was sufficient, now seemed hollow in comparison to the past weeks of shared existence. "I went to town yesterday," Tabitha said softly from her side of the room. Before the storm arrived, Samuel turned toward her voice. "Alone? How?" "I borrowed your mare, if that's acceptable." The road was clear enough, and I needed to introduce myself to the town council. "Of course it's acceptable," Samuel said, though the image of Tabitha navigating the 10-mile journey alone troubled him. "What did the council say about your accommodation situation?" "They were surprisingly unconcerned," she replied with a hint of amusement. Apparently, word had already reached them that I was staying with the reclusive Armstrong fellow. Several members seemed to find it quite entertaining. Samuel groaned. "I can imagine." The blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Donovan, took me aside afterward to assure me that while your reputation for unfriendliness is well established, no one has ever questioned your character. She seemed quite protective of you, actually. This was news to Samuel. He'd always assumed the townspeople regarded him with indifference at best, suspicion at worst. "I also inquired about the school building," Tabitha continued. "It's little more than 4 walls at present. No proper desks, no blackboard, certainly no books beyond a few donated primers." "Does that discourage you?" he asked. "On the contrary," she replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "It presents a worthy challenge. I've already begun drafting letters to my former colleagues in St. Louis who might contribute materials." Samuel listened as she outlined her vision for the Clearwater School, not just reading and arithmetic, but history, literature, even basic sciences. Her enthusiasm was contagious, making the project seem not just possible, but inevitable. "You truly believe you can accomplish all this?" he asked when she finally paused. "I believe we begin with what we have and build toward what we need," she said simply. "The frontier demands nothing less." "The frontier takes more than it gives," Samuel reminded her, repeating his earlier warning. There was a long pause before Tabitha responded, her voice gentler than before. "Perhaps that depends on what you're willing to give it, Samuel, and what you're willing to receive in return." The conversation ended there, but her words followed Samuel into his dreams, challenging assumptions he'd held as absolute since the day he'd buried his family. March brought the first real signs of spring, snowmelt swelling the creeks, early wildflowers pushing through the remaining patches of snow. Samuel found reasons to delay taking Tabitha to town permanently, and she seemed in no hurry to press the issue. Their coexistence had developed its own rhythm, a partnership neither had sought, but which now felt unexpectedly natural. One evening as they walked back from checking fence lines on the property's edge, Tabitha stopped suddenly, her attention caught by something on the distant ridge. "Riders," she said, pointing to small figures silhouetted against the sunset. 4 of them, coming this way. Samuel squinted in the fading light. Unusual to see that many together this time of year. They watched as the riders descended the ridge, clearly headed toward the cabin. As they drew closer, Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across his back. "Do you recognize them?" Tabitha asked, noting his tension. "Not yet," he replied, placing himself slightly in front of her. But 4 armed men arriving unannounced rarely brings good news. The riders slowed as they approached, and Samuel felt a cold recognition settle in his stomach as the leader's features became visible. "Vince Holloway," he muttered. "And his brothers." "Who are they?" Tabitha asked quietly. "Cattle thieves. I had a run-in with them 2 years back while working for the Drummond Spread. Caught them rebranding calves and testified against them in Helena." "What happened?" "Vince served 6 months. The others escaped conviction." Samuel's jaw tightened. "They swore they'd settle the score someday. Should we run?" Tabitha's voice remained steady despite the implication. Samuel shook his head. "Too late for that. Besides, I don't run from trouble." He turned to face her fully, his expression grave. "When we reach the cabin, I want you to go inside and stay there. Whatever happens, whatever you hear, don't come out." "I won't hide while you face danger alone," she protested. "This isn't up for debate, Tabitha. These men are dangerous, and I won't risk." He stopped abruptly, unwilling to complete the thought. "Risk what?" she pressed. Samuel looked into her eyes, the truth suddenly unavoidable. I won't risk losing someone else I care about. The admission hung between them as the riders drew ever closer. Tabitha's expression softened, but before she could respond, Samuel turned away, his attention focused on the approaching threat. "Go to the cabin," he said, his voice brooking no argument. Now, this time she obeyed, though reluctantly. Samuel watched until she was safely inside before walking out to meet the riders, his rifle held casually, but ready. Vince Holloway reined his horse to a stop 20 feet away, the others fanning out beside him. All four men wore the hard expressions of those accustomed to taking what they wanted by force. "Armstrong," Vince called, a cold smile spreading across his weather-beaten face. "Been a while." "Not long enough," Samuel replied evenly. "What brings you to my property, Holloway?" "Just passing through. Thought we'd pay our respects." Vince's gaze shifted to the cabin. "Heard you've got yourself some female company these days. Quite the talk of the territory, the hermit and the schoolmarm." Samuel's grip tightened on his rifle. "My personal affairs are none of your concern. State your business or move on." One of the other men, Rod, the youngest Holloway brother, spat on the ground. "Our business is settling debts. You cost us a lot with your testimony, Armstrong." "You cost yourselves by stealing what wasn't yours," Samuel countered. "The law handled it. There's nothing more to settle." Vince dismounted slowly, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. "The law," he said mockingly. "Out here, a man makes his own law. You forgot that when you ran to the marshal." The tension stretched between them as the other brothers dismounted as well, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Samuel remained still, calculating his odds against four armed men. They weren't good. "I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully," Samuel said, his voice deceptively calm. "There's no profit in this for you." "Oh, I disagree," Vince replied. "There's profit in reputation. In showing what happens to men who cross the Holloways." His smile widened, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "And maybe we'll pay your lady friend a visit too. Educational purposes, you might say." Something cold and deadly settled in Samuel's chest at the threat. These past months with Tabitha had awakened parts of himself he'd thought long dead. Not just the capacity for companionship, but the fierce protective instinct that came with caring for another. "That won't happen," Samuel said quietly. "No." Vince took another step forward. "And who's going to stop us? You're outnumbered, Armstrong. Even if you get lucky with that rifle, you can't take all of us." Samuel was about to respond when movement caught his eye, the cabin door opening. His heart sank as Tabitha stepped out onto the porch, but what she held in her hands made him momentarily speechless. A shotgun. His shotgun, which he kept mounted above the fireplace. "He won't have to face you alone," Tabitha called, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. She leveled the weapon with surprising confidence. "I suggest you gentlemen reconsider your position." The Holloway brothers exchanged glances, clearly not having anticipated this development. Samuel used their momentary distraction to adjust his stance, ensuring he had a clear shot at Vince. "The lady's right," came another voice from behind Samuel. He didn't dare turn, but he recognized the speaker immediately, Sheriff Tom Brenner from Clearwater. "I'd strongly advise reconsidering." Samuel risked a quick glance back to confirm what he'd heard. The sheriff sat on horseback just beyond the tree line, rifle aimed steadily at the Holloway brothers. Beside him were two deputies similarly armed. "This is a private matter, Sheriff," Vince protested, though his confidence had visibly faltered. "Threatening a citizen of my county on his own property is county business," Brenner replied calmly. "Now, you boys have two choices. Ride away and keep riding until you're out of Montana territory, or spend the next few years in the territorial prison." A tense silence followed as Vince weighed his options. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he stepped back toward his horse. "Another day, Armstrong," he growled. "There won't be another day, Holloway," the sheriff cut in. "You're done in these parts. I catch wind of you within 100 miles of here. I'll have wanted posters from here to the Dakota territory." The Holloway brothers mounted their horses with murderous glares, but offered no further resistance. Under the watchful eyes of the lawmen, they rode slowly back the way they had come. Only when they had disappeared over the ridge did Samuel lower his rifle, his heart still pounding with adrenaline. He turned to the sheriff with a questioning look. "Convenient timing," he remarked. Sheriff Brenner dismounted with a slight smile. "Not convenience. Good intelligence. Miss Vaughn visited my office yesterday to inquire about the Holloways after hearing rumors in town. When my deputy spotted them headed this way, she asked us to follow at a distance. Samuel turned toward the cabin, where Tabitha still stood on the porch, the shotgun now lowered but still in her hands. Their eyes met across the distance. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in Samuel's understanding of both himself and the woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. After the sheriff and his deputies departed, promising to ensure the Holloways left the territory, Samuel and Tabitha sat before the fire in a silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. "You should have stayed inside," Samuel finally said, though without real anger. "You should have told me about your history with those men," she countered. "We've been living together for months, Samuel. Did you think I wouldn't want to know about potential dangers?" "I thought they were in the past," he admitted. "And I'm not accustomed to sharing my concerns. Because you've convinced yourself that isolation is safer than connection." Tabitha's tone was gentle but insistent. "That caring for others only leads to loss." Samuel stared into the fire, uncomfortable with her accuracy. "Experience has taught me as much." "Experience has taught you that life contains loss," she corrected. "But in avoiding connection to prevent pain, you've denied yourself joy as well." She hesitated, then continued more softly. "Until recently, perhaps." Their eyes met across the hearth, and Samuel found he couldn't look away. In Tabitha's steady gaze he saw not just intelligence and courage, but something he'd been running from since the day he'd buried his family, the possibility of beginning again. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed quietly. "Do what?" "Care for someone. Risk losing someone. I've spent 3 years convincing myself that the frontier demands solitude, that attachment is a weakness I couldn't afford. And now," she prompted when he fell silent. Samuel took a deep breath. "Now I find myself more afraid of returning to that solitude than of whatever risks come with feeling as I do." "And how is that, Samuel?" Tabitha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment stretched between them, fraught with possibility. Samuel had faced armed men, violent storms, and wild animals without flinching, yet this simple act of emotional honesty terrified him more than any frontier danger. "I've fallen in love with you," he finally said, the words emerging rough but clear. "I didn't intend to. I didn't believe it was possible. But here we are." Tabitha's expression softened, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Here we are indeed," she agreed. A cowboy who believed love had no place on the frontier, and a schoolteacher determined to prove that beauty and learning belong everywhere. She smiled then, radiant in the firelight. "Perhaps we were both right, in our ways." "And how do you feel?" Samuel asked, suddenly uncertain. "I have no right to expect." "Samuel Armstrong," Tabitha interrupted, rising from her chair to kneel beside him. "I have watched you these past months. I've seen your kindness disguised as practicality, your gentleness hidden behind stoicism, your capacity for joy peeking through when you thought I wasn't looking." She took his hand in hers. "How could I not love you in return?" The revelation struck Samuel with the force of physical impact. For years, he had accepted the frontier's harshest lesson, that survival required sacrifice, that attachment was vulnerability, that solitude was the price of security. Yet here was Tabitha, educated, beautiful, capable of thriving anywhere, choosing him in this difficult life. "The cabin is too small," he said abruptly, "and crudely built. You deserve better." Tabitha laughed, the sound brightening the room. "Of all the responses I imagined, that wasn't among them." "I'm serious," Samuel insisted. "If we're to have a future together, a proper future, we need a proper home. Room for your books, for students perhaps, for children," she suggested gently when he faltered. Samuel nodded, suddenly able to envision a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. "For children. Our children. Then we'll build it," Tabitha said simply. "Together." "But Samuel," she squeezed his hand, "this cabin has already become a home. Because home isn't about the structure. It's about who shares it with you." 1 year later, the residents of Clearwater gathered on a warm June afternoon to witness the marriage of Samuel Armstrong and Tabitha Vaughn. The ceremony took place on the front porch of their new home, a spacious 2-story structure that stood as testament to Samuel's skill and Tabitha's vision. The house sat on a gentle rise overlooking the valley, its large windows designed to capture both morning sun and evening vistas. Behind it stood a red barn housing their expanded livestock, and to one side, a smaller building that served as Tabitha's schoolhouse during the week. As Samuel spoke his vows, his voice clear and confident in the summer air, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The man who had once believed the frontier offered only isolation and hardship now stood surrounded by community, partnership, and purpose. Tabitha had changed too. Her idealism remained intact, but it had been tempered by frontier realities. Her school had opened the previous autumn with 12 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old. By spring, the number had grown to 20, as even the most practical-minded parents recognized the value of what she offered. "I, Samuel, take you, Tabitha, as my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death parts us." As Tabitha repeated the same promises, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A snowstorm, an overturned wagon, a woman too stubborn to surrender to frontier hardship, all conspiring to challenge his most deeply held convictions about what life could offer. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana," the minister announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Samuel drew Tabitha into his arms, sealing their vows with a kiss that promised far more than words could express. The assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause, but for Samuel, the world had narrowed to this one woman who had taught him the most important frontier lesson of all, that true courage wasn't found in facing danger alone, but in daring to build something worth protecting. That evening, after the celebrations had ended and their friends had departed, Samuel and Tabitha stood together on the porch of their new home, watching as the setting sun painted the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Happy?" Samuel asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Tabitha leaned into him, her golden hair catching the last rays of sunlight. "Completely. And you, Mr. Armstrong? Has the frontier proven kinder than you expected?" Samuel considered the question, remembering the bitter young man who had built a solitary cabin and filled it with books instead of people. How certain he had been that the frontier offered only two choices: isolation or heartbreak. "The frontier is exactly as harsh as I believed," he finally said. "It demands everything you have and then asks for more. It tests every weakness and exposes every fear." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "But what I never understood, what you taught me, is that we aren't meant to face it alone. That sharing the burden doesn't double it, it halves it. And that sharing joy multiplies it beyond measure." Tabitha's eyes glistened with tears as she reached up to touch his cheek. "For a man who once claimed to have no words for feelings, you found them rather beautifully." Samuel smiled, still marveling at how natural it now felt. "I had an excellent teacher." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, planning the garden they would plant, discussing which students needed extra attention, debating names for children they hoped would come. Their voices mingled with the evening sounds of the frontier, distant coyotes, whispering pines, the occasional lowing of cattle in the pasture below. It was not an easy life they had chosen. There would be harsh winters and failed crops, illness and hardship, all the challenges the frontier could devise. But as Samuel held Tabitha close under the vast Montana sky, he knew with absolute certainty that they would face each one together, not just surviving, but building something that would outlast them both. When fate had brought them together that snowy day, the cowboy had indeed found his forever, not an escape from the frontier's demands, but in the courage to embrace them alongside the woman who had reminded him that even in the harshest landscapes, love could not only survive but flourish.